When a millionaire abandons his injured racehorse in the freezing wild, a lonely Wyoming farmer risks everything to save it, unaware that her act of kindness will spark a redemption neither of them ever expected. The wind howls across the valley, carrying the echo of hooves once cheered by thousands. Under the pale dawn, one broken creature and one weary soul are about to change each other's fate forever. The morning sun poured over Churchill Downs like liquid gold, glinting off the rails and the polished saddles of the finest horses in the country. In the grandstand, beneath a sea of designer hats and champagne glasses, Richard Hale sat in his private box. He wore a charcoal gray suit, crisp and cold as the man himself, and his eyes were locked on the track. Today wasn't about beauty or tradition. It was about dominance. His horse, Lightning, was the centerpiece of that empire, sleek, black as midnight, and bred to win. The crowd stirred as the gates clanged open. A ripple of power surged through the air as 12 horses exploded forward, but only one seemed to glide instead of run. Lightning's hooves struck the ground with impossible grace, each stride longer, smoother, faster. Richard leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening as he watched the animal move like something divine. "That's it, boy," he muttered. "Show them who you are." The announcer's voice crackled through the speakers, sharp and electric. "Lightning takes the lead. Look at that speed. Unbelievable!" The stands erupted. Women cheered. Men shouted his name. Richard didn't move. Victory to him was not a joy. It was a right. Each race was another line in his long ledger of power. And then it happened. Just as the finish line came into sight, Lightning's front leg struck the slick patch of damp dirt. There was a sound. A small, snapping crack, barely audible over the roar, but the animal's body faltered. In an instant, all that momentum turned into silence. Lightning crashed to the ground, dust and pain rising in the air like a ghost. The crowd gasped. The announcer stopped mid-sentence. Richard's expression froze. His empire, his pride, his invincible horse lay trembling in the dirt. Trainers ran to the scene, their white shirts flashing against the chaos. A veterinarian dropped to his knees, touching Lightning's leg with careful fingers. The animal's chest heaved violently, eyes wide, nostrils flaring in agony. When Richard reached the track, his expensive shoes sank into the wet earth. The veterinarian looked up, face pale. "It's a torn tendon, sir. With rest and care, he'll live. But he'll never race again." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. The crowd's murmurs faded into an eerie quiet. Then he exhaled through his nose, cold and controlled. "Then it's useless," he said simply. The vet blinked. "Sir, he can still—" "Do what? Eat my money?" Richard turned away, brushing a speck of dirt from his cuff. "Put him down or take him away. I don't care how you do it. I don't keep broken things." That night, the racetrack emptied. The champagne lost its fizz, and the floodlights blinked out one by one. Richard Hale returned to his mansion outside Lexington, where the trophies gleamed along the hallway. Hundreds of them, each one shining like a lie. He poured himself a drink, staring at the wall of gold, but saw only the reflection of the horse's eyes, wild and betrayed. Lightning, meanwhile, lay alone in the stable. The smell of hay and iodine filled the air. His injured leg was wrapped tightly, and a low hum of pain escaped his chest every few breaths. When footsteps echoed outside, he raised his head, expecting the gentle voice of a caretaker. Instead, a stranger opened the door. A man in a raincoat, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. "Sorry, boy," the man murmured. "Orders are orders." He led the limping horse into the trailer. The world outside was dark, rain hammering the metal roof as the engine rumbled to life. Lightning's reflection flickered in the side mirror, a shadow of what once was magnificent. The ride was long, and somewhere along the endless highway, the rhythm of the rain began to sound like applause, cruel, hollow applause for the fall of a champion. The truck stopped in the middle of nowhere. Wind swept across an open stretch of land, flat, cold, and endless. The man stepped down, unlatched the gate, and motioned for Lightning to move. The horse hesitated, trembling, then obeyed. His hooves sank into the muddy ground. The man reached out and touched Lightning's neck once, a brief human gesture that almost broke him. "Forgive me," he whispered. Then he turned, climbed into the truck, and drove away. The headlights cut across the darkness, growing smaller and smaller until they vanished behind the line of distant hills. Lightning stood there, alone, his breath a cloud in the freezing air. He limped forward a few steps, calling out softly, once, twice, but there was no answer, only the endless sigh of the wind. Above him, the sky stretched like a bruised ocean, and the first snow of winter began to fall. The great champion of the Kentucky Derby lowered his head to the earth, not as a gesture of defeat, but of confusion, of heartbreak. For the first time in his life, Lightning had no finish line to run toward. And far away, in a quiet valley in Wyoming, the dawn would soon rise, where another life, another soul was about to awaken, unknowingly waiting for him. The storm had passed hours ago, leaving the Kentucky backroads slick and shining beneath the truck's headlights. The driver's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. He was an old ranch hand, one of the few who still cared about the animals he transported. But tonight, he was paid to forget that part of himself. Behind him, in the rattling trailer, Lightning shifted, the chains clinking softly with each bump in the road. For miles, there was nothing but darkness and rain. The radio hissed with static. Somewhere along the way, the man turned it off and drove in silence, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard. "I'm sorry, boy," he muttered again, words swallowed by the hum of the engine. He didn't know exactly where he was going, just that it was far enough, as Mr. Hale had ordered. Far enough to erase the memory. When the truck finally stopped, dawn had barely touched the horizon. The road was empty. No houses, no fences, no lights. Only the endless stretch of open country where the earth met the sky. The driver stepped out, boots sinking into the mud, and opened the back gate. Lightning hesitated. His breath came out in plumes of white against the cold air, his body trembling from exhaustion. The man tugged gently on the rope. "Go on now," he whispered, voice breaking. "You're free, I guess." The horse limped forward, his injured leg stiff and fragile. He looked around, confused, the wind cutting through his mane. The man untied the rope and stepped back. For a moment, Lightning turned his head. Their eyes met. One full of guilt, the other full of questions no human could answer. Then the truck door slammed, the engine roared, and the vehicle pulled away, throwing mud behind its tires. The world fell silent. Lightning stood alone on the desolate land. The air smelled of wet dirt and frost. He took one uncertain step, then another, his hooves squelching in the mud. A crow called from a dead tree nearby, the sound echoing through the emptiness like a warning. There was no barn, no fence, no voice calling his name, only the whisper of the prairie wind, endless and cold. He walked until the pain grew unbearable, then rested beside a cluster of dry reeds near a narrow creek. The water there was thin and silver, moving slow as glass. When he bent to drink, his reflection rippled across the surface, no longer the proud racehorse of Lexington, but a shadow, ribs faintly visible beneath a coat dulled by rain and despair. He tried to lift his head high, as he once did when the crowd roared his name, but the strength was gone. He was simply another forgotten animal now, a casualty of someone's ambition. By afternoon, the sky cleared into a dull gray. Lightning began to wander again, following the faint scent of grass. Hunger gnawed at him, but every step sent a shock of pain through his leg. He paused often, resting his weight awkwardly, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. The land was vast, rolling hills stretching toward Wyoming's distant edge. Somewhere beyond those hills, there were farms, small, struggling, and stubbornly alive. And there, unbeknownst to him, lived a young woman whose heart still believed in second chances. As evening fell, coyotes cried in the distance. Lightning's ears flicked toward the sound, instinct urging him to move, but his body refused. He found a patch of dry ground beneath a leaning pine and folded down, breathing hard. The smell of damp earth mixed with the sharp resin of pine needles. He closed his eyes briefly, and memories flickered. Bright lights, thunderous applause, Richard's cold stare. They came and went like dreams he could no longer touch. The night deepened, heavy and indifferent. A thin veil of snow began to drift from the clouds, dusting his mane and back in white. Lightning didn't shiver. The exhaustion was too deep, the pain too constant. Yet somewhere, buried under that weight, was a spark, the stubborn will that had once carried him across finish lines. He would not die here. Not yet. At dawn, the sun rose pale and distant. Steam rose from his nostrils as he lifted his head and looked toward the west. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke. Human life. A direction. He began to walk, slow and uneven, toward it. Across the valley, miles away, smoke indeed curled upward from a small cabin roof. Emma Carter had woken early, as she did every day, to feed her chickens and start the fire. She didn't know that somewhere beyond the ridge, a broken horse was limping toward her life, carrying the weight of someone else's cruelty and his own fading pride. The cold air cut through Lightning's lungs, but he kept moving. His injured leg trembled, each step a struggle. By midday, he reached the edge of the valley where the snow had melted into patches of soft, wet earth. There, at last, he stopped. The sound of running water drifted from nearby, the same creek that wound behind Emma's small Wyoming farm. He lowered his head and drank greedily, the icy water burning down his throat. His body sagged, trembling with relief. A quiet peace settled over the land. The sky had cleared completely now, painted in soft blues and whites. Birds returned, circling above him. He didn't notice. He only felt the warmth of the sun seeping into his back, dulling the ache in his bones. For the first time in days, he rested without fear. And then, footsteps, light, rhythmic, and human, the faint sound of a bucket clinking against metal. Lightning's ears twitched. He lifted his head, eyes narrowing toward the noise. Over the curve of the hill, a figure appeared. Small, slender, moving slowly down the path toward the creek. A young woman. She walked with a steady pace, her brown hair braided loosely, a red scarf fluttering against the wind. She didn't see him yet, too focused on her task. Lightning froze, unsure whether to flee or stay. But the exhaustion anchored him. He remained still, watching her. The woman stopped at the water's edge and crouched, dipping her buckets into the stream. That's when she noticed the reflection beside hers. Dark, breathing, and alive. She turned sharply, and their eyes met for the first time. The wind held its breath. He didn't move. She didn't either. Between them stretched a fragile line. Fear, curiosity, and something older than either of them could name. The woman straightened slowly, whispering under her breath, "Easy, easy, boy." The voice was soft, warm, and familiar in a way that made Lightning's muscles unclench just slightly. The girl took one careful step closer. The morning sun stretched across the Wyoming Valley, washing the hills in soft gold. The air smelled of pine and cold water. Birds trilled in the distance, and the world seemed new again after the storm. Emma Carter moved down the narrow trail with her wooden buckets clanging against one another, her boots sinking into the damp earth. She had walked this path every morning since her father's death, a quiet ritual that kept the silence of their small farm from swallowing her whole. Her cabin sat on a rise just above the creek, surrounded by a patch of fenced land where a few chickens scratched the ground, and a dog named Rusty patrolled like a loyal soldier. Emma's life was simple, almost invisible to the world. Tending animals, mending fences, reading old letters her father had written when times were kinder. But this morning, the air felt different. There was a heaviness to the wind, a pulse beneath the quiet. As she reached the creek, she knelt and lowered her bucket into the water. That's when she saw it. Another reflection beside hers. Dark. Rippling. Enormous. She froze. Slowly, she turned her head. Just a few yards away, half hidden by the reeds, stood a horse. Its coat shimmered in shades of black and bronze beneath the sunlight, but it was coated in mud, and one leg trembled as it struggled to stand. Emma's breath caught. She had seen wild horses before, but this one was different. His eyes weren't wild. They were wounded, intelligent, almost human. "Easy," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The horse flinched, but didn't flee. His ears twitched toward her, uncertain. Rusty barked sharply behind her. Emma turned quickly, raising her hand. "No, Rusty, stay." The dog hesitated, whining, then sat down, watching with cautious eyes. Emma turned back to the horse. "It's all right, boy. I'm not going to hurt you." She took a slow step forward, then another. The horse shifted, weight pressed to his uninjured leg. A thin cut streaked his flank, dried blood turning dark against his coat. His breathing was shallow, labored. Emma's heart clenched. She had known hardship, losing her father, keeping the farm afloat, patching roofs with her own hands. But she had never seen suffering like this. "Who did this to you?" she murmured, her voice cracking. The wind answered with nothing but silence. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small crust of bread she had meant for her breakfast. She extended it toward him, palm open. The horse's nostrils flared. For a long moment he just stared. Then, slowly, his head lowered, lips brushing against her palm. The soft weight of his breath made her eyes sting. "There now," she said, softly. "You see? I'm no threat." She stepped closer until she could see the faint scars along his neck, the brand barely visible beneath the dirt. Someone had owned him. Someone who'd cared enough to mark possession, but not enough to keep him safe. Emma noticed the swelling in his front leg, the way he favored it with every movement. Her mind raced through what little she knew of horse care. Her father had kept a few work horses years ago, and she remembered the smell of liniment and hay, the way he spoke to them as if they were people. "You need rest," she whispered, "and clean water. Maybe I can help you." Lightning, though she didn't yet know his name, lifted his head, studying her face. His eyes were deep pools of exhaustion and fragile trust. In that gaze, Emma saw something she recognized, the quiet, stubborn will to keep living when everything else had turned away. Carefully, she looped a piece of rope from her bucket handle, forming a rough lead. "I'll take you home," she said, almost to herself. The horse hesitated when she slipped the rope around his neck, but didn't resist. His body trembled as he took the first step beside her, then another. The walk back was slow, every movement measured. Emma kept talking, softly, constantly, as if her words could bridge the distance between fear and faith. "You'll be okay. I'll find some herbs, wrap that leg, maybe call Dr. Mason if I can afford it." She smiled faintly, though there was no one to see it. "I don't have much, but I've got a warm stall and clean straw. That's something, right?" When they reached the small barn beside her cabin, she led him inside. The space was old, patched together with mismatched boards and the faint smell of hay. Rusty trailed behind, tail low but curious. Emma guided the horse to a corner where a pile of dry straw waited. He hesitated before lowering himself slowly, wincing as his injured leg folded beneath him. Emma knelt beside him, brushing the mud from his coat. "You poor thing," she murmured. "How long have you been out there alone?" The horse turned his head slightly, his dark eye reflecting her face in its glossy surface. She fetched a bucket of clean water and set it near his head. He drank deeply, splashing some across the floor. The sound filled the small space like music. That evening, when the wind picked up again, Emma lit an old oil lamp and sat near him, wrapping his leg with torn strips of linen soaked in warm water and herbs. The rhythmic sound of her movements, the squeeze of cloth, the quiet clink of metal, filled the silence. Outside, Rusty barked once, then fell quiet. "You're safe now," she whispered, tying off the bandage. "No one's gonna hurt you again." The horse shifted, his heavy head sinking toward the straw. Emma reached out, resting a hand gently on his neck. The warmth beneath her palm was steady, alive. The horse exhaled a long, slow breath, the kind that comes when something broken finally stops resisting. Emma leaned back against the wooden wall, exhaustion settling over her. The lamplight flickered, painting their shadows across the boards. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. She looked at the sleeping horse and smiled softly. "I think I'll call you Lightning," she whispered. "You deserve a name that remembers who you used to be." The horse's ear twitched as if he understood. Emma pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and listened to the slow rhythm of his breathing. The wind pressed gently against the walls, and the scent of hay and oil filled the air. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Outside, the moon climbed high over the valley, silvering the roof of the little barn. Two souls, one wounded, one weary, had found each other in a world that had forgotten them both. And when the night finally settled into stillness, Emma whispered a promise to the dark. "We'll get through this, you and I." Lightning stirred, his tail flicking once, a quiet answer in the silence. The first morning after she found him, the barn smelled of damp hay and slow hope. Sunlight leaked through the cracks in the wooden boards, striping the dirt floor with gold. Emma Carter woke to the sound of breathing, steady, heavy, and for a moment, she forgot there was another living creature sharing her world again. Then she remembered. The horse, Lightning, the stranger she'd brought home from the river. She rose quietly, brushing dust from her jeans, and stepped toward the stall. Lightning stood awkwardly, his weight still favoring his left foreleg. His coat, now dried, revealed a hidden beauty beneath the mud. Deep chestnut darkened to near black along the spine, the sheen of muscle dimmed by neglect. When Emma spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "Good morning, boy. How's that leg holding up?" He flicked an ear toward her, the smallest acknowledgement. That was enough. She filled his water bucket and poured oats into an old tin trough. The sound drew him closer, careful and slow. Watching him eat made something in her chest loosen. There was life in those movements, fragile, but persistent. She smiled, whispering almost to herself, "You're tougher than you look." Over the next days, Emma slipped into a rhythm. Each sunrise began with chores, feeding chickens, tending the garden, and ended in the barn with Lightning. She cleaned his wounds, changed his bandage, rubbed his neck to ease the tension beneath his skin. She talked while she worked, not because she expected a response, but because silence was heavier when it had nowhere to go. She told him about her father, how he'd taught her that horses were like people, proud, stubborn, and quick to lose faith if they weren't treated gently. "He used to say a creature doesn't heal because you force it to," she murmured one night as she wrapped the swollen leg with fresh cloth. "It heals because you make it believe it's safe again." Lightning breathed deeply, eyelids lowering. His trust came slow, but it came. On the 5th day, Emma decided to let him try walking outside. The Wyoming sky was a deep, endless blue, the kind that made even loneliness feel softer. She led him out with a rope looped loosely around his neck. Rusty followed at a distance, tail wagging uncertainly. The horse took his first step into the sunlight. His hooves sank into the soft dirt, and he hesitated, as if the open air might betray him again. Emma kept her hand on his shoulder. "Easy now," she said. "One step at a time." He limped forward, muscles trembling, but the world didn't collapse beneath him this time. The second step came easier. The third, almost natural. By the time they reached the edge of the pasture, the rhythm had steadied. Emma laughed softly, a sound that startled even her. "Look at you," she said. "You're doing it." Lightning paused, lifted his head toward the wind, and for a heartbeat, his posture changed. The weak, beaten creature she'd rescued was gone. In his place stood the faint outline of something noble. His mane stirred against the breeze, his eyes brightening with a trace of the fire he once carried. That night, Emma sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the last glow of sunset fade behind the mountains. The valley had always been quiet, but now the silence carried a different weight. Hope, she realized, had a sound. It was the slow rhythm of breathing from the barn, the creak of boards, the beating of a heart too stubborn to give up. The following week brought small miracles, the kind no one writes about. Lightning began to nicker softly when Emma entered the barn, no longer wary of her touch. He learned to nudge her shoulder when she forgot to bring him an apple. He even tolerated Rusty's curious sniffs, though the dog would retreat quickly after each uncertain whinny. One afternoon, while brushing Lightning's coat, Emma discovered a faint scar along his neck, a burn mark shaped like a brand. She traced it with her fingertips, her brow furrowing. "Someone owned you," she whispered. "Someone who didn't deserve you." Lightning turned his head slightly, eyes meeting hers. For a long moment, neither moved. Emma sighed, continuing her strokes with the brush. "Doesn't matter now. You're mine as long as you want to be." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain. The sound of thunder rolled far away, but Emma felt no fear this time. Storms came and went. That was life. What mattered was what stayed when they passed. Later that evening, she sat beside Lightning's stall, reading aloud from an old book her father had left behind, a collection of letters he'd written to her mother during their early years on the ranch. The pages smelled of dust and time. Her voice, though quiet, filled the barn like a prayer. "Don't let this land harden. You," she read softly. "Kindness is a language the wind remembers." She looked up at Lightning. "Guess that's why you found me, huh?" The horse snorted gently, almost as if in agreement. Emma smiled, closing the book. Weeks passed. The swelling in his leg went down, the limp easing with each day. He began to wander farther, grazing near the fence line. Sometimes Emma would catch him staring toward the mountains, as if remembering a different life, a world of thunderous applause and polished saddles. But when she called his name, he would turn back to her. One evening, as the sun burned low and orange, Lightning trotted, truly trotted, for the first time. It was uneven and brief, but it was real. Emma gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "You did it!" she laughed, tears stinging her eyes. He stopped, turned toward her, and exhaled sharply, the sound like pride rediscovered. That night, Emma wrote in her journal by lamplight, "Some things heal quietly, without anyone noticing." Maybe that's how miracles work. They don't arrive loud. They grow, one heartbeat at a time. Outside, Lightning lay in the straw, eyes half closed, the faint hum of crickets rising in the distance. The moonlight softened the edges of everything. Barn walls, fences, hearts. In that quiet Wyoming valley, a woman and a broken horse were teaching each other how to live again. And neither of them knew that far away, in a city lined with marble and glass, the man who had abandoned him was about to hear his name spoken once more. In the city, glass towers pierced the morning sky, and Richard Hale's reflection stared back at him from the window of his penthouse. The man in the glass looked older than he remembered, his hair grayer, his jaw harder, the lines around his eyes deeper. Below, the streets pulsed with life, every sound sharp and certain. Yet, beneath all that movement, Richard felt a dull hum of unease, the kind that creeps into quiet moments and never quite leaves. He poured coffee into a porcelain cup, its surface trembling in his hand. The front page of the Lexington Herald lay open on the counter. The headline wasn't about his company's latest expansion or another of his winning horses. Instead, it was a human interest story. Local woman rescues injured horse in Wyoming. The photograph beneath the title caught his attention like a strike of lightning. There it was. That face. That body. That unmistakable dark coat and proud head lowered in trust beside a young woman in a flannel shirt. Richard's heart stopped. Lightning. The article was short but detailed. How a farmer named Emma Carter had discovered the wounded horse near a creek and nursed him back to health. It even mentioned that the horse had a faint racing brand. Almost illegible now, but enough to trace its origin to Kentucky. Richard's hand clenched around the cup until porcelain cracked. Coffee spilled across the newspaper, blurring the ink for a butts. Moment. He simply stared at the mess, his breath tight. He could have ignored it, should have. The horse was gone, written off, buried under 100 other failures and successes. But pride is a cruel master. It whispers that nothing you once owned should belong to anyone else. Mr. Hale? A voice came from the doorway. His assistant, Margaret, stood there holding a folder. She hesitated when she saw his face. Are you all right? Richard's eyes lifted, cold and distant. Get me Hale and Winston Law. Tell them I want confirmation. That horse is mine. Within hours, the lawyers had traced the photo back to a small Wyoming town, a remote valley barely visible on the map. They confirmed the horse's brand matched the one from Richard's stable. It appears the woman's kept it alive, one of them said through the speakerphone. Quite a story, actually. People online are calling her some sort of hero. Richard's jaw flexed. A hero, he repeated, the word sour in his mouth. For stealing my property. The line went silent. Then the lawyer cleared his throat. Technically, you abandoned it, sir. Richard's voice hardened. You let me worry about the details. Find her. I want the horse back, quietly. When the call ended, Richard sank into the leather chair behind his desk. The city stretched endlessly outside the window, but his mind was far away. Back in that moment on the racetrack, the smell of dirt and fear heavy in the air, the vet's words echoing. He'll never race again. That night, as rain began to fall over the city, Richard couldn't sleep. The tapping of water against the window sounded too much like hooves against the ground. In his dreams, lightning ran again, fast, powerful, unstoppable, until the leg gave way and the world turned to dust. He woke in a sweat, his breath uneven. By dawn, he'd made his decision. Pride disguised itself as purpose. He would reclaim what was his. Meanwhile, far across the plains, the Wyoming sky was wide and clean. Emma Carter leaned against the fence, brushing strands of hay from her sleeves. Lightning grazed nearby, the morning sun catching the scar on his leg like a thin line of silver. His coat had regained its shine, his muscles strength. When he lifted his head, the wind caught his mane and flung it backward in a dark ripple. Emma smiled. You're getting handsome again, she said, scratching Rusty's ear as the dog lay beside her boots. Her neighbor, Sam Walker, rode up on his mule with a slow wave. He was a tall man with a weathered face and a permanent half-smile. He's looking better every time I come around, Sam said. Didn't think he'd make it through the winter. He's tougher than he looks, Emma replied. Aren't we all? Sam chuckled, glancing at the horse. You ever figure out where he came from? Emma shook her head. No. Doesn't really matter, does it? Whoever had him before didn't deserve him. Sam's gaze drifted to the faint brand on Lightning's neck. Still, that mark's not from around here. You might have found yourself something important. Emma frowned, brushing her hand across the scar. He's just Lightning. That's all I need to know. Sam nodded, but didn't press further. As he rode off, the question lingered in the air like dust. That evening, when the sun slipped behind the ridge, Emma lit her lamp and began writing in her notebook. Simple records of chores, expenses, and thoughts. Lightning's leg improving. Fence repair tomorrow. Sold eggs to the millers. Then, almost without thinking, she added, Sometimes I wonder who hurt him. Sometimes I think maybe I understand. Outside, a truck engine echoed faintly in the distance, far too early in the season for visitors. Lightning lifted his head, ears pricking toward the sound. The noise faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind through the grass. 2 days later, strangers appeared at the general store in town. Men in pressed jackets and polished boots, their accents wrong for Wyoming. They asked about a woman named Emma Carter and a large black horse. The shopkeeper, old Mr. Briggs, squinted at them but said little. News traveled fast, though, and by sunset, it reached Emma's ears. She stood at the porch railing, hands tightening around the wood. They're looking for you, she murmured, eyes fixed on Lightning. He stood calm beneath the spreading shadow of the barn, his tail swishing lazily. He didn't know. He couldn't. But Emma did. She'd seen that look before, the kind of men who came not because they cared, but because they wanted to own. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the lamplight flickering against her face. Outside, Lightning moved in slow circles within the pasture, the moonlight tracing the line of his back like silver fire. She thought of the brand again, the scarred reminder of whoever had claimed him before fate had set him free. They're not taking you, she whispered into the dark. Not after everything. Miles away, Richard Hale's private jet touched down at a regional airfield just outside Jackson Hole. The engines hissed to silence, and he stepped onto the tarmac, his long coat whipping in the cold wind. His assistant handed him a folder. Maps, property lines, the name Emma Carter printed in neat type. Let's finish this quickly, Richard said, his voice low. The wind carried his words away, scattering them across the mountains. Back at the farm, Emma opened the barn door one last time before sleep. Lightning lifted his head, eyes catching the lamplight. She walked to him, brushing his mane with her fingers. Whatever happens, she said softly, we'll face it together. The horse leaned into her touch, steady and warm. The night pressed close around them, filled with the weight of things unspoken, the kind of silence that always comes before a storm, the morning. Broke clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming dawn that paints every blade of grass silver. Emma Carter was in the barn early, sweeping the floor, humming softly to herself. Lightning stood in the stall behind her, his dark coat gleaming beneath the weak sunlight seeping through the slats. He had grown strong again, his limp almost gone, though his scar remained. A pale, jagged memory against his neck. Rusty lay stretched out by the door, tail flicking in his sleep. Everything felt still. Ordinary. Safe. Then, in the distance, came the faint sound of hooves. Slow, deliberate. Not the hurried rhythm of a rancher or the clatter of a passing rider, but something heavier, synchronized, too steady to belong to anyone from town. Lightning's ears twitched. He lifted his head sharply, nostrils flaring. Emma froze, broom suspended mid-air. A moment later, a knock echoed against the wooden post outside. 3 firm raps, polite but sharp enough to slice the morning silence. Emma stepped into the light, squinting against the brightness. At the end of her dirt driveway stood 2 men in long coats beside a truck that gleamed too clean for these parts. One of them, tall and lean, held a folder in his hand. The other wore dark sunglasses despite the pale sun. "Miss Carter?" the tall one called, his tone businesslike. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Richard Hale of Lexington, Kentucky." The name struck Emma like a cold hand. She didn't answer. The man continued, taking a step forward. "We're looking for a horse, registered under the name Lightning, marked with a racing brand. We have reason to believe you might have him." Emma's pulse thudded in her ears. Behind her, Lightning shifted, sensing her tension. She turned slightly toward him, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You have no reason to be on my land. Whatever you're looking for, it isn't here." The man gave a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're not here to cause trouble. But the horse in question is Mr. Hale's property, abandoned due to medical circumstances. He's within his rights to reclaim it." Emma crossed her arms. "Abandoned, you said? Then he gave up those rights. You don't get to throw something away and expect it to come running back when you change your mind." The second man adjusted his sunglasses, his tone cooler. "You may not want to make this difficult, Miss Carter. Mr. Hale is a powerful man." "I've seen powerful men before," she replied evenly. "They all sound the same." For a long moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold still. The first man finally spoke again, his voice softening. "We understand you've cared for the animal. Mr. Hale would compensate you fairly for your trouble." He extended the folder, its edges crisp and white against the rough world around them. Emma didn't take it. "You think this is about money?" she said. "That horse nearly died out there. I found him starved, broken, left to rot. And now you show up with papers like that makes it right." "Legally," the man began, but Emma cut him off. "Morally," she said, "you're wrong." Behind her, Lightning let out a low sound, almost a growl disguised as a whinny. The men glanced toward the barn, unease flickering in their eyes. Emma stepped back, placing herself between them and the door. "You should leave," she said quietly. The taller man hesitated, clearly not used to resistance. Then he nodded once, curt and professional. "We'll report back to Mr. Hale." As they turned to go, the shorter man muttered, "You'll regret this." Emma didn't answer. She watched until their truck disappeared over the hill, leaving behind a trail of dust that shimmered in the morning light. Only when the sound faded did she allow her body to relax. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed fierce. Rusty barked once, breaking the tension. Emma knelt, scratching his ear. "Good boy," she whispered. Then she looked at Lightning. He stood tall now, watching the horizon where the men had gone, his muscles taut, his eyes alert. "They'll be back," Emma said softly. "But so will we." The rest of the day passed in uneasy calm. She worked harder than usual, mending fences, hauling feed, stacking hay, tasks that normally soothed her, but now only filled the silence. Every creak of the windmill, every passing truck made her look up. That evening, Sam Walker stopped by with a bundle of firewood. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, handing her the logs. Something like that, she replied, forcing a smile. Sam leaned on the fence. Those men from town came asking questions. Suits, shiny boots. I didn't like their look. Emma's stomach tightened. They were here this morning. Sam's face darkened. What did they want? The horse. He spat into the dirt, shaking his head. Figured it'd be something like that. People like that don't come all this way for nothing. What are you gonna do? Emma glanced toward the barn, where Lightning's silhouette moved slowly against the lamplight. I don't know yet, but I'm not giving him up. Sam studied her for a moment, then nodded. You got a good heart, Emma. Just make sure it doesn't get you hurt. When night fell, the farm settled into its usual rhythm, the creak of the barn, the rustle of the wind through the cottonwoods. Emma sat by the window, staring into the darkness. Her reflection in the glass looked older somehow, lined by worry. Lightning stood outside, head lowered, grazing quietly beneath the stars. The moonlight traced his scar like a silver thread. He looked peaceful, but Emma knew that peace was fragile, hanging by a thread between two worlds, the simple one she'd built and the cruel one coming to reclaim him. She rose and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky vast. Lightning lifted his head when she approached. She reached up to stroke his muzzle, her breath visible in the cold. They'll try again, she whispered. But they don't know us, do they? We're not afraid of storms. The horse blinked slowly, leaning into her touch. She smiled faintly. Tomorrow, we'll fix the north fence. And maybe we'll ride a little. The promise hung between them like a vow. Far away, in a warm hotel room in town, Richard Hale poured himself a drink and stared at a stack of reports on his desk. She refused? He asked quietly. His lawyer nodded. She was persuasive. Richard's jaw tightened. Then I'll go myself. Lightning's world had once been defined by racetracks and crowds, Emma's by fields and quiet mornings, but soon both worlds would collide beneath the same sky, and neither would ever be the same again. The day Richard Hale arrived, the sky was the color of steel. Clouds hung low over the mountains, pressing the air into a strange, expectant stillness. Emma Carter sensed it before she saw him. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. She was repairing the north fence when she heard the sound, not the lazy clatter of ranch hooves, but the sharp rhythm of trained horses, fast and certain. When she looked up, 3 riders appeared over the hill. At the front was a man in a dark overcoat, his figure rigid, deliberate. He didn't look like he belonged to this land. Lightning, grazing nearby, lifted his head and froze. Emma felt her throat tighten. She dropped the hammer in her hand, brushing dirt from her jeans as she stood. The rider stopped at the edge of her property. The man dismounted slowly, movements precise, controlled. When he removed his hat, Emma recognized him immediately, not because she had seen him before, but because everything about him fit the image she had drawn in her mind of the one who had left Lightning to die. Richard Hale didn't need to introduce himself. The arrogance in his posture did it for him. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice deep and calm, honed by years of authority. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Emma crossed her arms. "If you mean the horse, you're mistaken. He doesn't belong to anyone." Richard's mouth twitched, almost into a smile, but not quite. "You're young," he said, "and idealistic. I can appreciate that. But property is property. You found him. I'm grateful. I'll make sure you're compensated." "I don't want your money," she said. "That's convenient," he replied. Because this isn't about what you want. It's about what's right. Emma laughed quietly, shaking her head. Right? You left him bleeding in the cold. You threw him away because he wasn't perfect anymore. Richard's gaze hardened. He was a racehorse, Miss Carter, not a pet. You don't understand what that means. I understand exactly what it means, she said. It means you cared more about winning than about living things. A long silence fell between them. The only sound was the wind stirring through the dry grass. Rusty growled from the porch, low and steady. Richard took a step closer. I'm not your enemy, he said. I came here to settle this peacefully, but I will not be humiliated by a stranger who doesn't know the world she's stepping into. Emma didn't move. Her voice came out steady, though her pulse hammered in her chest. I'm not trying to humiliate you, Mr. Hale. I'm just standing where you refused to, between what's alive and what's convenient. Lightning shifted behind her, his hooves crunching against the dirt. Richard's eyes flicked toward the sound. For the first time, his confidence faltered. The horse he'd discarded looked different now, stronger, calmer, his coat shining beneath the muted light. He remembers you, Emma said quietly. Every time he hears an engine or a voice that sounds like yours, he freezes. That's what you left behind. Richard swallowed, the faintest flicker of discomfort crossing his features. You think you can fix him? He asked. I already have, she said. The wind picked up then, swirling dust between them. Richard blinked against it, his jaw tightening. I'll give you one last chance, he said. Sign the papers. You can keep him on your land, call him whatever you like. But legally, he remains mine. Emma stepped forward, close enough to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, not just from age, but from years of pretending not to feel. You can't own something that chose to leave you, she said. Not him. Not anymore. For a moment, the two simply stared at each other. Then from behind her, lightning moved. He limped forward, not in fear, but with purpose. He came to stand beside Emma, his body between her and Richard. Richard's breath caught. The last time he'd seen the horse, lightning had been broken, unable to stand without shaking. Now, though the scar still glimmered on his leg, his eyes were alive again, fierce and steady. That's what you gave up, Emma said softly. Richard looked at the animal. Really looked this time. The anger in him flickered, dimmed, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. But pride dies hard. He tore his gaze away. You think kindness will keep him safe? The world doesn't work that way. Maybe not, she said. But it's a start. He exhaled through his nose, sharp and impatient. You're making a mistake. Emma smiled faintly. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Richard turned, signaling to his men. We're done here, he said. As he mounted his horse, he looked back once more. You've made this more complicated than it needed to be. Don't expect this to end nicely. Emma didn't answer. She watched them disappear over the hill, their figures swallowed by the pale horizon. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Not empty, but charged, like the air before thunder. When she turned back, lightning was still standing beside her. She rested a hand on his neck, feeling the solid warmth beneath her palm. You did good, boy, she whispered. You stood your ground. That night, the sky opened in a cold drizzle. Emma sat by the window, her cup of coffee forgotten. Each drop on the glass felt like a countdown. She knew Richard Hale wasn't the kind of man who left things unfinished. Lightning stood outside under the overhang, his dark shape outlined by the barn light. Occasionally he raised his head toward the wind, as if he too could sense that something was coming. A change, inevitable and dangerous. Emma reached into her father's old trunk and pulled out a faded blanket, one she hadn't touched in years. She wrapped it around her shoulders, inhaling the faint scent of smoke and memory. "We've come this far," she said quietly, as if speaking to the night itself. "We're not backing down now." Outside, the clouds gathered heavier, pressing low across the valley. Lightning's breath formed mist in the cold air. The rain deepened to a steady rhythm, soft, relentless. And somewhere beyond those hills, Richard Hale lay awake in a hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why the sound of that horse's name still echoed in his mind. He had come for ownership. But what waited for him, he couldn't yet name. Not loss, not redemption, but something in between. Something he had forgotten how to feel. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the mountains like an army. By dusk, the Wyoming sky had turned a strange greenish gray, heavy and low. Emma Carter could feel it in her bones before the first thunder cracked. The horses in nearby fields began to whinny, restless, stamping their hooves. Inside the barn, Lightning shifted uneasily, his breath hot against the cool air. Rusty barked once, then crawled beneath the porch, whining. Emma hurried to close the windows, her hands trembling as the wind pressed against the walls of the cabin. The air smelled of rain and electricity, that sharp, metallic scent that meant trouble. She grabbed her old jacket and ran toward the barn, shouting over the rising wind, "Easy, boy! I'm here!" Inside, the air pulsed with tension. Lightning's eyes were wide, reflecting each flash of lightning that tore across the valley. The thunder hit seconds later, loud enough to rattle the boards. The horse reared slightly, striking the stall gate. Emma ran forward, grabbing the rope, her fingers burning against the coarse fiber. "It's all right, it's just noise," she cried, though her own heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her words. Another flash lit the sky. The door to the barn swung open, slamming against the wall. Rain swept in, cold and violent. Lightning jerked back, his muscles quivering. Emma tried to steady him, pressing her forehead against his neck. "You're safe," she whispered. "You're home." Outside, the wind howled louder, shaking the roof. Something metallic snapped, one of the hinges. Emma grabbed a heavy beam, propping it against the door to keep it from flying off completely. The moment she turned, Lightning kicked at the stall gate again. The latch cracked, splintering under his weight. "No!" she shouted. But the horse, driven by panic, lunged forward, breaking through. He stumbled into the open barn aisle, wild-eyed, sides heaving. Emma's boots slipped in the mud as she tried to block the exit. "Don't run! You'll hurt yourself!" But he was already halfway to the door, the storm's light cutting across his body like fire. The wind caught his mane, the rain stinging his scarred neck. And then a voice cut through the chaos. "Emma!" She turned. A figure moved through the rain, soaked and unfamiliar for a moment, until she saw the outline of the long coat, the glint of the truck's headlights behind him. Richard Hale. "What are you doing here?" she shouted, but her voice was lost to the thunder. He pushed forward, hand raised to shield his face. "I came to finish this." "You picked the wrong night," she yelled back, but there was no time to argue. Lightning reared again, and Richard's eyes widened. "He'll break his leg if he runs." "Help me!" Emma cried, and without another word, Richard stepped inside. Together, they moved toward the frightened animal. The barn shook around them. Richard grabbed a halter from the wall, his movements quick, practiced. For a moment, Emma saw the man he must have been once, someone who had known horses, who had cared, before greed had dulled that part of him. "Easy," Richard called out, his voice deep and commanding. Lightning's ears flicked toward him but didn't calm. He pawed the ground, mud splashing up his legs. Emma reached for his neck again, whispering, "You're safe. You're safe. We've got you." The horse's eyes darted between them, fear and confusion warring inside him. The thunder roared again, shaking the walls. A loose beam fell from above, crashing into the straw. Lightning spooked, jerking back. Richard dove forward, pulling the halter tight, and for a split second, Lightning froze. The old reflex, the voice of command, the authority he'd known from racing days, cut through the panic. "Good boy," Emma murmured, stepping close. "That's it. You're not alone." The storm screamed outside, wind tearing at the roof. Water leaked through the seams, soaking the straw. Richard and Emma worked together, leading Lightning back into the stall, blocking the door with heavy planks. They stayed like that, breathless, drenched, the three of them huddled in the trembling barn while the storm raged on. Hours seemed to pass before the thunder began to fade. Rain softened into a steady patter. Lightning's breathing slowed. Emma leaned against his shoulder, exhausted, her hair plastered to her face. Across from her, Richard stood silently, watching. His expression was unreadable. Pride stripped away, replaced by something rawer. "You risked your life for him," he said finally. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I didn't think about it," she replied. "When you care about something, you just move." Richard looked at the horse, then back at her. "You think he cares about you? You think animals remember who saves them?" Emma met his gaze. "Maybe not in the way you mean. But he's here, isn't he? Alive. Isn't that what matters?" Richard exhaled slowly, glancing at the scar on Lightning's leg. "He shouldn't have survived that race," he murmured. "He shouldn't have survived me." Emma studied him for a moment. The man who had once spoken like a king now sounded like a man facing the ruins of his own choices. "People change," she said softly. "Sometimes it just takes a storm to shake them awake." For a while, they listened to the rain. Lightning's head drooped, finally calm. The lamp Emma had hung from the beam flickered, its light trembling across Richard's face. When the silence settled between them, it wasn't hostile anymore. It was human. Richard stepped toward the stall door, resting a hand on the frame. "I came here to take him back," he said. "Now I'm not so sure why I'm here at all." Emma said nothing. She just watched him. The man who had once thrown away everything for pride, now standing like someone who had nothing left to prove. He looked at her again, rain still dripping from his hair. "You could have let him go," he said. "You didn't have to fight for him." Emma smiled faintly. "Neither did you tonight." He hesitated, then nodded once, quietly. Without another word, he turned and stepped out into the fading storm. The rain had thinned to mist, and the valley glowed faintly under the pale moonlight. His boots left dark prints in the mud, already filling with water as he walked away. Emma stayed where she was, listening until the sound of his footsteps disappeared. Then she turned to Lightning. The horse blinked slowly, calm again, his breathing deep and steady. She brushed her fingers over his neck. "You see?" she whispered. "Even storms pass." Outside, the clouds began to break apart, revealing a strip of clear sky. The moon shone brighter, casting silver across the soaked land. Somewhere far off, the first notes of dawn were beginning. Inside the barn, Emma sat beside Lightning until the world was quiet again. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether Richard Hale would return or whether the peace would hold. But for now, there was warmth and breath and the soft sound of rain on wood. And that was enough. The storm left behind a world rinsed clean. By morning, the fields around Emma's farm glistened beneath a fragile light, the air still damp with the scent of rain and soil. The clouds had broken apart into thin ribbons across the Wyoming sky. It was the kind of calm that follows chaos, not silence, but something deeper. A kind of surrender. Lightning stood outside the barn, steam rising from his coat as the first sunlight touched him. His body bore the marks of what he had survived, the faint scar along his leg, the lean muscle rebuilt through months of care. Emma leaned against the fence, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Her eyes followed the horse's slow, steady movement as he grazed. He was stronger now, surer. For the first time, he looked like he belonged entirely to the land. Sam Walker rode up a few minutes later, his breath visible in the cool morning air. "He looks good," he said, dismounting his mule. "Didn't think he'd pull through that storm." "He's tougher than both of us," Emma replied with a smile. Sam tilted his hat back, squinting at the horizon. "Word in town is there's going to be a festival in Jackson this weekend. State fair, big thing. Folks are bringing their best stock to show off. You should take him. Let people see what you've done." Emma shook her head. "He's been through enough. I don't need strangers gawking at him." Sam leaned against the fence beside her. "Ain't about them gawking. It's about them seeing. There's a difference. You didn't just save a horse, Emma. You reminded people that not everything broken stays that way." She looked out at Lightning again. The wind brushed through his mane, carrying the faint sound of the distant creek. Maybe Sam was right. Maybe it was time for others to see what hope could look like. 2 days later, Emma hitched her old trailer to her truck. Lightning stepped inside without hesitation. His trust was absolute now. Rusty jumped into the passenger seat, tail wagging. As the engine turned over, Emma caught her reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, wind-chapped cheeks. But there was a light there she hadn't seen in years. The fairgrounds were alive with sound when she arrived. Laughter, music, the sharp calls of auctioneers echoing through the air. Children ran between booths selling fried dough and hand-carved toys. The scent of hay and sweet cider hung everywhere. Emma guided Lightning through the crowd, keeping her hand on his reins. Heads turned as they passed. Whispers followed. "Is that the horse from the papers?" "That's the one she found in the river." "No way he was a racer once." Lightning moved calmly, unbothered. His coat shimmered beneath the sunlight, and his stride, though imperfect, carried a quiet dignity that drew eyes wherever he went. When they reached the exhibition ring, a man with a microphone stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we have a special entry today, a story that's captured the heart of this community. This is Lightning, the horse rescued from the wilds by Miss Emma Carter." Applause rippled through the crowd. Emma's face flushed red as she nodded politely, leading Lightning into the ring. She hadn't come for applause, but the sound carried warmth instead of vanity. It was like hearing the heartbeat of something larger than herself, a shared gratitude that life could still surprise them. She guided Lightning in a slow circle. His movement wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The limp was faint now, the result of countless nights of care and quiet courage. When she stopped in the center, he lifted his head high, eyes bright beneath the sunlight. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. From the edge of the crowd, a figure watched, a man in a dark coat, older, quieter than the last time she'd seen him. Richard Hale stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horse he'd once thrown away. When Lightning turned his head and their eyes met, something shifted inside him. Gone was the animal of his ambitions. What stood before him was something freer, untamed by greed. He felt the weight of what he had lost, not property, not prestige, but the piece of himself that had known gentleness. After the exhibition, the crowd thinned. People stopped Emma to shake her hand, to thank her for reminding them what compassion looked like. She smiled, answering softly, never taking credit. "He saved himself," she told them. "I just made sure he had the chance." By late afternoon, the sun had begun to dip. The fairgrounds glowed with that golden hour light that made everything look like memory. Emma was packing up when Richard approached. His voice was quiet, stripped of the edge it once carried. "You did well," he said. Emma turned, surprised but not startled. "You came." "I wasn't sure why," he admitted. "Maybe to see if he was really alive. Or maybe to understand why you fought so hard for him." "He's alive because someone believed he could be," she said simply. Richard looked at Lightning, who was grazing nearby. "He looks different," he murmured. "Peaceful." "He's free," Emma corrected. Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "You made him that." "No," she said, shaking her head. "He made himself that. I just refused to give up when it was easier to walk away." He stared at her for a long time, the noise of the fair fading into the background. "I used to think strength was about control," he said. "Now I'm starting to think it's about knowing when to let go." For once, Emma didn't argue. She simply met his gaze and said, "Then maybe you've learned something after all." He smiled faintly, a rare, quiet gesture. "Maybe." Before he left, he reached into his coat and handed her a folded envelope. "No contracts, just a donation. For the farm. For him." Emma hesitated, then took it. "Thank you," she said. "But I didn't do this for money." "I know," Richard replied. "That's why it matters." And he turned to go. Lightning lifted his head, snorting softly. Richard stopped, glancing back one last time. Their eyes met, man and horse, and for a brief moment the world stilled. There was no ownership between them, no past or punishment, only a silent acknowledgement that forgiveness, even unspoken, could exist. By evening, the fair was winding down. The crowd thinned into silhouettes against the orange horizon. Emma loaded the trailer, patting Lightning's neck. "Let's go home," she whispered. The drive back through the valley was quiet. The sky burned with color, red melting into gold, then violet. The radio hummed low, playing an old song her father used to love. She looked over at the horse in the trailer's small window, his calm eyes reflecting the fading light. Back at the farm, she opened the gate and let him roam. The wind swept across the open field, carrying the faint scent of sage and rain. Lightning moved slowly, then faster, his hooves striking the soft ground in a rhythm that felt like triumph. When he reared against the dying sun, his silhouette seemed larger than life, the image of resilience itself. Emma watched from the fence, tears stinging her eyes. In that golden hour, she understood. Not every miracle comes with fanfare. Some are quiet, standing against the wind, proof that survival can be beautiful. And somewhere beyond the hills, a man in a dark coat drove east, carrying with him the echo of hooves and the faint, humbling peace of a heart finally at rest. Years had a way of softening even the hardest edges of memory. Seasons rolled through the valley, winters of silver quiet, summers that shimmered like gold dust in the air. Time, once a relentless current, had slowed into something gentle for Emma Carter. Her hair, now streaked with silver, fell loose over her shoulders as she sat on the porch, a blanket around her knees, watching the sun drift behind the hills. The farm had grown, not in size, but in spirit. The fences had been mended so many times they told stories of their own. The barn bore new coats of paint, its red walls bright against the fading square. She had built more stalls over the years, each one sheltering an animal that needed saving. A one-eyed mule, a mare with a crooked gait, 2 dogs that refused to be apart. Every creature here had a story, and all of them began the same way. Someone had given up on them before Emma found them. Lightning grazed near the edge of the field, slower now, but still proud. His black coat had faded to deep brown with age, but the light still caught his mane, streaking it with fire whenever he turned his head. The limp was there, faint, almost graceful in its persistence. He didn't race anymore, didn't need to. Every step he took was victory enough. Emma smiled as she watched him move through the grass. She could still remember the sound of his hooves that first night, frantic, desperate, and the way his eyes had met hers by the creek. That was a lifetime ago. She couldn't say who had saved whom anymore. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low, the kind that promised a summer storm but never quite delivered. She breathed it in, the taste of it familiar. "You feel that?" she murmured toward the field. "Rain's coming again." Lightning raised his head, ears twitching toward her voice. Even now, after so many years, he still came when she called. He began to walk toward her, slow but steady, his breath visible in the cooling air. As he approached the fence, Emma stood, setting aside her mug of tea. "Come on, old man," she said softly. "You've still got that same look, you know, like you're thinking about running off just to see if I'd come find you." He stopped before her, lowering his head until it brushed against her shoulder. She laughed quietly, the sound soft and worn. "You've always known how to answer without saying a word." The evening deepened around them, painted in orange and violet. Fireflies began to blink among the tall grass, tiny sparks against the dusk. Rusty was long gone now, but a younger dog, one of his offspring, slept at Emma's feet, tail twitching in dreams. The world seemed content, and for once, so was she. On the porch table lay a worn photograph, a picture from years ago, taken at the fair. She and Lightning stood side by side, his coat gleaming, her hand resting on his neck. Behind them, a banner fluttered. "The Miracle Horse of Wyoming." She traced the edge of the photo with her finger, smiling faintly. "You became something bigger than either of us, didn't you?" She didn't mean fame or recognition. What they'd built together had spread quietly. People who heard about Lightning came to see him, left inspired, returned home to adopt strays, to volunteer, to build small sanctuaries of their own. Compassion had a way of echoing farther than the noise of cruelty. That, Emma thought, was his real race, the one he'd kept running long after the track lights went out. A car approached from the distant road, its headlights bobbing along the dirt path. Emma shaded her eyes. Curiosity piqued. Visitors weren't uncommon, though these days they came less often. The car stopped near the fence, and a young woman stepped out, her city jacket too thin for the mountain chill. She smiled nervously as she walked toward the porch. "Miss Carter?" she asked. Emma nodded. "That's me." "I'm from Lexington," the girl said. "I work with the Hale Foundation. Mr. Hale asked me to deliver something." Emma's breath caught. It had been years since she'd heard that name spoken aloud. She gestured for the girl to sit, though her heart had already begun to understand what this visit meant. The young woman reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope, edges creased from travel. Emma turned it over in her hands. The handwriting on the front was neat, deliberate. Richard Hale's. She opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter written in the same hand. "Emma, I never thanked you properly for teaching me what I refused to see. I've built something in Lightning's name, a refuge for animals that no longer have a place in the world. They call it Hale Haven. But you and that horse are its true founders. I thought you should know. If you ever come east again, there will always be a home for you there. Until then, take care of him. He was my greatest mistake, and your greatest grace. Richard." Emma folded the letter slowly, her eyes stinging. "He finally learned," she whispered. The girl smiled gently. "He passed last winter. Peacefully, they said, but he made sure the foundation would continue." Emma nodded, looking out at the field. Lightning had moved closer again, his dark shape framed against the soft glow of the horizon. "I think he found his peace long before that," she said quietly. The messenger stayed a while longer, sipping tea, listening to stories about the horse who became legend. When she finally left, the night had settled completely. The moon hung low, full and golden, washing the fields in pale light. Emma walked down to the pasture, her steps slow but certain. Lightning turned toward her, as if sensing something in her quiet. She reached up to stroke his face, her fingers tracing the lines of age that matched her own. "You hear that?" she whispered. "We did good, you and I." He nickered softly, leaning into her touch. For a long moment, they simply stood there, woman and horse, surrounded by the whisper of grass and the hum of night. Later, when Emma returned to the porch, she sat for a long time watching him graze. The stars above were endless, sharp as silver. She thought of her father, of Richard Hale, of all the lost souls that had somehow found their way back to grace through this land. As the wind brushed her face, she closed her eyes and smiled. "Everything ends," she murmured, "but not everything is lost." The world around her breathed, steady, eternal. Lightning lifted his head once more, eyes glinting in the starlight, before lowering it again to the grass. In that quiet Wyoming evening, where the only sounds were wind and heartbeats, Emma Carter's story, their story, settled into legend. It wasn't carved in stone or sung in songs. It lived instead in the spaces between moments, in the stillness after storms, in the patience of healing, in the quiet grace of kindness that asks for nothing in return. And when dawn came again, soft and gold over the valley, it found them exactly as they had always been, together and free. If this story touched your heart, tell me what part stayed with you the most. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply say you were here. Your words keep these stories alive. And if you'd like to hear more true, soul-stirring tales of people and animals, make sure to subscribe and stay with me for the next journey.